just want to talk a little bit generally first about the way that work is changing. And I think that we all understand that work is changing, and it's changed dramatically over the last, certainly the last decade and a half. There's a view that the rigidities that are associated with traditional management and work methods are becoming outdated. We're dismantling hierarchy, we're dismantling command and control mechanisms within organisations, and we're trying to, or many progressive organisations are trying to move towards a situation where employees are given much more control over the work that they do and how they do it and how they achieve it. And improvisation is a major part of that. So allowing employees the freedom and space to decide how they want to achieve their work outputs is really becoming much more acceptable. And planning and process are being superseded by the ability to manage behaviours and deal with the softer elements of work. In other words, managing each other, managing our work, etc. And the message really is that actually work is nowhere near as predictable as we used to think it was. And it's people that construct work-based deliverables, and we need to engage with the whole people side of things. Structure and process is still necessary, but it's nowhere near as prevalent as it used to be. And I've pulled this from my project management background, really, because my background is as a project manager. Most of my research is done in project-based work. And really, most organisations are trying to do too much with too few resources. We're trying to deliver work of a given scope or quality, usually in compressed time frames, and usually with limited resources. And so the key question really is, how are changes in the outputs that occur during the product life cycle or the organisational life cycle actually managed? And basically, managers improvise. And managers improvise all the time. But I think realistically that what's happened historically is that managers have improvised, but they've improvised surreptitiously because improvisation was seen as something that wasn't really quite acceptable. That, you're supposed to, organisations have processes and procedures and plans and missions and strategies, and really you're supposed to stick with those. But actually most managers don't all the time. But when they step away from that process, often they feel that they don't want to be seen to be stepping away from that process, because if you're following a plan, then there's shared responsibility for the content of the plan because it's been prepared by a number of people collectively. If you improvise, you're usually improvising on your own, and that means that as soon as you step away from the plan and you improvise, you're exposed. If things go right, everything is fine, everybody's deliriously happy you found a new and better way of doing things, which I call emerging best practice. But if you screw up, if you fail, then you're really exposed, because the first thing your manager is going to say, if you're in an unsupportive environment, is, well, hey, we had a plan, why don't you stick to the plan? So people improvise, but they improvise surreptitiously sometimes, unless the culture of their organisation is supportive. In fact, in most organisations, there are two different parts of the organisation. There's the side of the organisation that is concerned with efficiency and control, with the efficient day-to-day operation of the organisation to get goods and services out of the door. That sort of requires stable routines, controlled environments, and structure and process, and that's fine. But there are other parts of the organisation that maybe produce new products or new ideas or new ways of doing things that rely on improvisation, rely on intuition and creativity, and that requires a much looser and more flexible environment. So sometimes you need different sorts of cultures and environments in different parts of the organisation, and there's a real tension between the two parts of most organisations, between the structured, routinized, getting the product out of the door type bit, and the stuff that comes up with new ideas and innovation. And one of the ways of managing it, in my view, is over-communication, both formally and informally, at every level of the organisation. Let people know what's happening. I'm not going to overdo this, but some quick theory about improvisation. Improvisation really came out of some work that was done in 1998 by Christine Moorman and Ann Miner at the University of Minnesota. And they developed 3 initial component parts or constructs of improvisation. Creativity, so new ideas about how to achieve things. The use of intuition, the use of an intuitive gut feel about what's possible within the structure and resources and capability of the organisation, what you feel intuitively will work in a given situation. And actually, I could talk about intuition for an hour. Intuition is an incredibly powerful thing and something that we don't use enough. And the third construct was something called bricolage, which is a French or Spanish word depending on which way you want to look at it, which basically means doing the best thing you possibly can with the resources that you have at hand at a particular time. The thing about improvisation is it usually means doing something now, and that means you don't have time to marshal additional resources. You just got to do what you can with what you've got at hand. And Moorman and Miner defined improvisation as the degree to which composition and execution converge in time. So we're talking about planning and executing either simultaneously or almost simultaneously. In 2001, there was another paper that was brought out by the same authors, Christine Miner and Ann Moorman, and another guy called, a woman called Paula Bassoff, all again from Minnesota. And they actually identified 4 additional constructs. Adaptation, in that we don't always do something new. What we do is, through experience, we adapt routines, interventions that we've used before in similar situations, and we think, okay, I did this 6 months ago and it worked quite well. This is a sort of similar situation. So if I take that back off my sort of mental shelf and tweak it a little bit, then it ought to work here. And that's often what improvisation is. It's not completely new. It's about adapting things that have worked for you before. And we tend to think about that in terms of experience. You know, we think people who are good at that, we tend to think of them and say, oh, this is an experienced manager. He's been around the block. He's done this before. He understands, you know, what's required. He has lots of these sort of interventions that he's used before that he can adapt to new scenarios. Improvisation is about compression, usually compression of time, by simplifying and shortening steps to make things happen quicker. It's about the use of innovation, as in deviation from existing practices and knowledge, trying to do something a little different, or maybe using the knowledge that you have and the practices that you have in a slightly different way in order to achieve something. And of course, obviously, you know, learning hopefully comes out of that. So I've arranged these things as inputs and outputs, if you like. And some of the outputs could also be inputs, because if we think of creativity, intuition and bricolage as inputs, and adaptive routines and the compression of time and innovation as outputs, and then they lead to learning, which is then fed back into the process. But you could argue that certainly adaptation, adaptive routines, are actually outputs to the next round of improvisation. And in the same way, you know, innovations can be inputs as well as outputs. Improvisation doesn't stand alone. Nobody's suggesting for 1 minute that you don't have a plan. But it's difficult to plan for every eventuality. Requirements change. Sometimes you need to react to market and other forces. There are emerging issues that you have to deal with, issues of complexity and ambiguity that you have to deal with. And of course, we talked earlier on in the other room about the fact that improvisers, effective improvisers, I'm talking in terms of jazz musicianship, they're virtuoso musicians who work within a framework in order to achieve something that works for everybody. And improvised work is done by people who are good at what they do, and experience helps immensely. So, I mean, there are ways to encourage improvised work. The first thing is that you create the time and space for people to try new things, to try new ways of achieving. You need a culture that doesn't blame people for stuff that goes wrong. It's inevitable that not every improvisational intervention is going to work successfully. But even if it doesn't work, you've still learned something. You know, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that it's important. It is as important to know what doesn't work as to know what works. Knowing what works is always better, but knowing what doesn't work is still learning. It's still important. Sharing successful improvisational interventions within the organisation. Some organisations are better at doing this than others. Some people do it more formally, some people do it more informally. But if you can share successful improvisational interventions, then that raises the game for everybody. It raises the confidence level. It allows people to see that this is good, that you know that there are benefits here. And of course, part of the thing that underpins improvisational work is the tacit knowledge of your employee base. Framework to contain improvisational activity. We talked about a framework for jazz music. We talked about timing structures and keys and things like that. You need the same sort of thing within organisations. Set a framework, allow people to go so far but no further, and then as you build trust in the ability of your employees to improvise effectively, then you can relax that framework over time. So effective improvisation is when things get done better or faster, when things get done with less resource, when you learn for the future, and when the knowledge gained results in emerging best practice that can be embedded in more effective future activity. That's the way I see it. But I said I'd come to managing risk. You have to manage the downside. You have to look at what could go wrong and how to recover from that if it does go wrong. So you don't want to be improvising in places where it's really sort of dangerous. I mean, I tend to use the example of Nick Leeson of Barings Bank because I'm an ex-banker. You know, he was given a little too much room to improvise without any real structure, and he blew the entire capital base of the bank in 6 months. You know, you really don't want to get into that situation. So you need to look at the downside. Can I recover if my team improvises and it's not effective, it doesn't work? Is this happening somewhere where it could impact on the project or the organisation big time? Do I trust my team to do this? And you know, start small, relax the framework as you build trust and allow people to build their improvisational abilities over time. I mean, I see improvisation as it being important because it taps into the tacit knowledge and experience of members of the organisation, project team members in the case of the research that I do mostly. It assists with resolving issues of poor specification sometimes. It helps to resolve ambiguity and complexity because you can allow space for improvised resolution of things that come, you know, when you don't expect them, or things that you don't know yet. It allows team members to grow and mature and to earn trust. It builds job satisfaction, it builds teams, it means less micromanagement, it can assist with the compression of timescales, it can make back time overruns, it produces better ways of achieving tasks and activities, and it produces what I call emerging best practice, which I think is one of the most valuable things that an organisation can be seeking.